Catherine Parr's death at the young age of 36 might have seemed like the end of her story, but in many ways it was just the beginning of her true legacy. The woman who had survived marriage to Henry VIII and used her position to heal a broken royal family had planted seeds that would grow and flourish long after her death. Her influence would shape the future of England in ways that even she could never have imagined. The most immediate and visible impact of Catherine's life could be seen in the three royal children she had helped to raise and educate. Princess Mary, Princess Elizabeth, and King Edward had all been profoundly influenced by their time with Catherine, and each would carry her lessons with them as they faced the challenges of ruling England. Princess Mary, who became Queen Mary I in 1553, never forgot the kindness and respect that Catherine had shown her during those difficult years when she had been rejected by her father. Even though Mary remained a Catholic and disagreed with Catherine's Protestant beliefs, she remembered how Catherine had treated her with dignity and had helped restore her to her father's favor. When Mary became queen, she showed unusual restraint in her religious policies, especially in the early years of her reign. Many historians believe that Catherine's example of thoughtful reform rather than violent revolution influenced Mary's approach to governing. But it was in Princess Elizabeth that Catherine's influence was most clearly and powerfully seen. Elizabeth had lived with Catherine during some of the most important years of her education and development. From Catherine, Elizabeth learned that a woman could be both intelligent and strong, both learned and practical. She saw how Catherine had used her education as a weapon and a shield in the dangerous world of court politics. When Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth I in 1558, she brought Catherine's lessons with her to the throne. Elizabeth's famous religious settlement, which found a moderate path between Catholic and Protestant extremes, bore the clear influence of Catherine's balanced approach to religious reform. Elizabeth's support for education, especially for women, echoed Catherine's pioneering example of female scholarship. Elizabeth also learned from Catherine how to survive and thrive in a world controlled by men. She saw how Catherine had used her intelligence to make herself indispensable to Henry, and she applied similar strategies in her own reign. Like Catherine, Elizabeth understood that knowledge and education were sources of power that no one could take away from her. Young King Edward, who ruled until his death in 1553, also carried forward Catherine's influence. The religious reforms that took place during Edward's reign reflected many of the moderate Protestant ideas that Catherine had supported. The emphasis on English-language religious services and Bible reading that characterized Edward's church policies were things that Catherine had championed during her time as queen. Catherine's influence extended far beyond the royal family to affect the broader development of English society and culture. Her books, especially Prayers or Meditations and The Lamentation of a Sinner, continued to be read and reprinted for decades after her death. These works provided a model for other women who wanted to write about religious and intellectual subjects. Catherine had proven that women could be serious authors and thinkers, not just in private but in public where their ideas could influence others. Her example opened doors for other women writers and established the important precedent that royal women could be intellectual leaders in their own right. This was revolutionary in a time when most people believed that women should remain silent on important matters. The circle of scholars and reformers that had gathered around, Catherine continued to promote the ideas about education and religious reform that she had supported. Many of these men went on to become important leaders in the English church and universities, spreading Catherine's influence throughout English intellectual and religious life. Catherine's impact on women's education was particularly significant and long-lasting. She had shown that women could master languages, theology, and philosophy just as well as men. Her support for Princess Elizabeth's extraordinary education proved that women could be prepared to handle the highest responsibilities of leadership. This example inspired other noble families to provide better educations for their daughters. The moderate Protestant religious ideas that Catherine had promoted became central to the development of the Church of England. Her emphasis on personal Bible reading, English language services, and salvation through faith rather than works helped shape the distinctive character of English Protestantism. Her writings provided a gentle, accessible introduction to these ideas that helped many ordinary people understand and accept the religious changes happening around them. Catherine's political legacy was also important. She had shown that a queen could be an active partner in government rather than just a decorative figure. Her success in healing the relationships between Henry and his children demonstrated that royal women could play crucial roles in maintaining family unity and political stability. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine Parr had proved that intelligence, courage, and careful planning could triumph over even the most dangerous circumstances. In an age when royal wives were expected to be submissive and ornamental, she had shown that a woman could be a true partner, advisor, and leader. Catherine's tomb at Sudeley Castle became a symbol of her remarkable life and achievements. When it was rediscovered in the 19th century, people were amazed to find the grave of the queen who had lived when so many others had died. The inscription on her tomb honored her not just as Henry's wife, but as a woman who had made her own important contributions to English history. Modern historians have come to recognize Catherine Parr as one of the most significant figures of the Tudor period. She was far more than just the wife who survived Henry VIII. She was a pioneer of women's rights, a religious reformer, a talented author, a skilled politician, and a loving stepmother who helped shape the next generation of English rulers. Catherine's story continues to inspire people today because it shows how one person with intelligence, courage, and determination can make a real difference in the world. She faced seemingly impossible challenges and found ways to not just survive, but to use her position to help others and create positive change. The woman who had started life as the daughter of a minor northern nobleman had become one of the most influential queens in English history. Catherine Parr had proved that true power comes not from birth or beauty, but from the strength of character and the willingness to use one's gifts to make the world a better place. The summer of 1548 was both the happiest and most difficult time of Catherine Parr's life. She was heavily pregnant with her first child at the age of 35. Living in the beautiful Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire with the man she had always loved. After years of navigating the dangerous waters of court politics and surviving marriage to the most feared king in Europe, Catherine should have been enjoying a peaceful and joyful time as she prepared to become a mother. But peace seemed impossible for Catherine. Her husband Thomas Seymour's dangerous ambitions continued to grow, and his reckless behavior was putting their entire family at risk. Thomas spent his days plotting against his brother Edward, who ruled England as Lord Protector for young King Edward VI. Thomas complained constantly that he deserved more power and influence, and he was becoming more desperate in his schemes to challenge his brother's authority. Catherine tried her best to calm Thomas and make him understand how dangerous his plotting could be. She had survived the treacherous world of Henry's court by being careful and diplomatic, and she could see that Thomas's wild ambitions would eventually lead to disaster. But Thomas was too proud and too angry to listen to his wife's wise advice. He believed that marrying Catherine had given him the right to be treated as an equal to his brother, and he could not accept his lesser position in the government. As her pregnancy advanced, Catherine found it harder to deal with the stress of Thomas's political schemes. She was worried about the future of their unborn child and afraid that Thomas's reckless behavior would destroy the happiness they had found together. Catherine had already lost 2 husbands to death, and now she was terrified that she might lose her third husband to his own dangerous ambitions. Despite her worries, Catherine continued to prepare for the birth of her baby with excitement and hope. She had always wanted children, and after years of childless marriages, this pregnancy felt like a miracle. She spent her time reading, writing, and planning for the future she hoped to build with Thomas and their child. She even continued working on her religious writings, finding comfort in her faith during these difficult times. On August 30th, 1548, Catherine went into labor at Sudeley Castle. The birth was attended by skilled midwives and doctors, and at first everything seemed to be going well. After hours of labor, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl whom she named Mary Seymour, in honor of her stepdaughter Princess Mary and her husband's family name. Catherine was overjoyed to hold her daughter for the first time. After 35 years of life and 3 marriages, she finally had the child she had always dreamed of having. Baby Mary was beautiful and healthy, and Catherine felt that all her struggles and sacrifices had been worth it to experience this moment of perfect happiness. But Catherine's joy was short-lived. Within days of giving birth, she began to show signs of serious illness. In those days, many women died from complications after childbirth, and the medical knowledge needed to help them was very limited. Catherine developed what doctors today would recognize as puerperal sepsis, a dangerous infection that often killed new mothers in the 16th century. As Catherine's condition worsened, she began to suffer from fever and delirium. The strong, intelligent woman who had survived marriage to Henry VIII and navigated the most dangerous court in Europe was now fighting for her life in a battle she could not win with her usual weapons of intelligence and diplomacy. During her final days, Catherine's fevered mind turned to dark thoughts about her marriage and her husband's behavior. In her delirium, she accused Thomas of not really loving her and suggested that he was already planning to marry other women even before she died. She spoke bitterly about his treatment of Princess Elizabeth and his dangerous political plotting. These accusations may have reflected Catherine's real fears about her husband's character, or they may have been the confused thoughts of a woman dying from infection and fever. Thomas was hurt and confused by his wife's angry words, but he also seemed more concerned about his own future than about losing the woman he claimed to love. Catherine Parr died on September 5, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth to her daughter. She was only 36 years old, and her death robbed England of one of its most remarkable and intelligent queens. Catherine had accomplished more in her short life than most people could achieve in twice as many years, but her death felt tragically premature to everyone who knew her. Catherine's funeral was held at Sudeley Castle, and it was notable for being the first Protestant funeral service ever conducted for a Queen of England. This was fitting since Catherine had been one of the leading supporters of religious reform during her lifetime. The service reflected the changes in English religious practice that Catherine had helped to bring about through her writings and her influence. The mourners at Catherine's funeral included many of the scholars, reformers, and courtiers who had been part of her intellectual circle during her years as queen. They remembered her not just as Henry VI's wife, but as a woman who had used her position to advance learning, support religious reform, and heal the broken relationships in the royal family. Thomas Seymour's behavior after his wife's death revealed the true nature of his character and his priorities. Instead of mourning Catherine properly or caring for their infant daughter, Thomas immediately began plotting his next moves to gain political power. Within months of Catherine's death, he was scheming to marry Princess Elizabeth, seeing her as another path to influence and authority. Baby Mary Seymour, Catherine's precious daughter, faced an uncertain future without her mother's protection. As a newborn infant, she was completely dependent on others for care, but Thomas seemed more interested in his political schemes than in being a father. The little girl who had brought Catherine such joy would soon disappear from historical records, probably dying in infancy without the loving care that only her mother could have provided. Catherine's death marked the end of an extraordinary life that had been cut short just as she was beginning to enjoy the freedom and happiness she had always sought. She had survived the most dangerous marriage in English history, only to die from the common tragedy of childbirth complications that claimed so many women of her era. On the cold morning of January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII took his last breath at Whitehall Palace. Catherine Parr, who had survived the most dangerous marriage in English history, suddenly found herself in a position that none of Henry's previous wives had ever experienced. She was alive, she was free, and she was wealthy beyond most people's dreams. At 34 years old, Catherine was finally able to make her own choices about love and marriage without fearing for her life. The news of Henry's death spread quickly through the palace, and within hours the entire kingdom knew that the terrifying king was gone. His 9-year-old son Edward became King Edward VI, but because he was too young to rule alone. The government was taken over by a group of powerful nobles led by Edward Seymour, the new king's uncle who became Lord Protector of England. For Catherine, Henry's death brought both relief and uncertainty. She had played the dangerous game of royal marriage and won, but now she faced new challenges. As the Queen Dowager, she held an important position in English society, but she no longer had the protection that came with being the king's wife. She would need to be careful about her next moves, especially since the religious and political situation in England was still very unstable. Catherine's first priority was securing her financial future. As Henry's widow, she was entitled to keep all the lands and money that had been given to her during their marriage. She also received a generous pension that would allow her to live in comfort for the rest of her life. But more importantly, Catherine was now free to follow her heart for the first time since she was a young woman. Almost immediately after Henry's death, Catherine began to think about Thomas Seymour, the man she had been forced to give up when the king decided to marry her 4 years earlier. Thomas was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour and uncle to the new young king. He was still handsome, charming, and ambitious, and Catherine discovered that her feelings for him had not changed during the years of her marriage to Henry. Thomas Seymour had also been thinking about Catherine. During her marriage to Henry, he had watched from a distance as she skillfully navigated the dangerous waters of court politics. He had seen how she had survived the heresy crisis of 1546, and how she had managed to stay in Henry's favor until the very end. Thomas was impressed by Catherine's intelligence and strength, but he was also attracted by her wealth and position as Queen Dowager. The courtship between Catherine and Thomas began almost immediately after Henry's funeral. They met secretly at first, remembering the passion they had shared years earlier and talking about the future they could now build together. Catherine felt young and alive again in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. After years of being careful and diplomatic with Henry, she could finally be herself with someone who truly appreciated her mind and her spirit. But their romance was complicated by the dangerous political situation in England. Thomas Seymour was jealous and resentful of his older brother Edward, who had become the most powerful man in the kingdom as Lord Protector. Thomas believed that he deserved to have more influence over his young nephew King Edward, and he was angry that he had been given only minor positions in the new government. Catherine was worried about Thomas's bitter feelings toward his brother, but she was so happy to be in love again that she ignored the warning signs of his dangerous ambitions. In May 1547, just 4 months after Henry's death, Catherine and Thomas were secretly married in a private ceremony. They knew that their hasty marriage would cause scandal, since royal widows were expected to wait at least a year before remarrying, but they were too much in love to care about what other people might think. When news of their secret marriage became public, it created exactly the kind of scandal that Catherine had feared. Many people thought it was inappropriate for the former queen to remarry so quickly after her husband's death. Others worried that Thomas Seymour was using his marriage to Catherine to increase his own political power and challenge his brother's authority as Lord Protector. The situation became even more complicated when 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth came to live with Catherine and Thomas at their home in Chelsea. Elizabeth had always been close to Catherine, who had been like a mother to her during the difficult years of Henry's reign. But Thomas Seymour's behavior toward the young princess soon created serious problems that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. Thomas began to pay inappropriate attention to Elizabeth, entering her bedroom in the mornings when she was still in her nightclothes and engaging in what he called playful behavior, but what others saw as dangerous and improper. Catherine was pregnant with her first child and may not have understood at first how serious the situation was becoming. She sometimes even participated in what seemed like innocent games, but the behavior was completely inappropriate for a grown man toward a teenage girl who was next in line to the throne after her brother Edward. As the months passed, it became clear that Thomas's attention to Elizabeth was causing serious problems. Servants began to gossip about what they had seen, and rumors spread that Thomas was planning to seduce Elizabeth and perhaps even marry her if anything happened to young King Edward. These rumors were extremely dangerous because they suggested that Thomas might be plotting to take control of the throne through his relationship with Elizabeth. Catherine finally realized that she had to act to protect both Elizabeth's reputation and her own household's safety. In a painful decision that showed her wisdom and strength, she sent Elizabeth away from their home, even though it meant losing the companionship of the girl she loved like a daughter. Elizabeth was hurt and confused by being sent away, but Catherine knew it was the only way to stop the dangerous situation from getting worse. Catherine's pregnancy should have been a time of great happiness. At 35, after years of childless marriages, she was finally going to have a baby with the man she loved. But instead of joy, her pregnancy was overshadowed by worry about her husband's dangerous political schemes and his inappropriate behavior toward Elizabeth. Thomas continued to plot against his brother and dream of gaining more power in the government. He talked about taking control of young King Edward and complained constantly about being treated unfairly. Catherine tried to calm him and convince him to be satisfied with the comfortable life they could have together, but Thomas's ambition was stronger than his love for his wife. The summer of 1546 began like any other at King Henry's court, but beneath the surface of royal ceremonies and daily routines, a deadly plot was taking shape. Catherine Parr had survived 3 years of marriage to the most dangerous king in Europe, but now her enemies were closing in. They had found what they believed was the perfect weapon to destroy her, and this time Catherine would need every bit of her intelligence and courage to escape with her life. The leader of the plot against Catherine was Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a powerful and conservative churchman who hated the religious changes that were sweeping through England. Gardiner had watched with growing anger as Catherine used her influence to support Protestant ideas and reformers. He saw the Queen as a dangerous enemy of the traditional Catholic faith, and he was determined to stop her before she could do more damage to the old religious order. Working with Gardiner was Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley, another conservative who believed that Catherine had become too powerful and too bold in her religious opinions. Together, these men represented the old guard at court, nobles and churchmen who wanted England to return to traditional Catholic ways and who saw Catherine as the main obstacle to their plans. The opportunity these enemies had been waiting for came when they discovered evidence of Catherine's involvement with banned Protestant books. During the 1540s, Henry had made it illegal to own or read certain religious texts that promoted Protestant ideas. Anyone caught with these forbidden books could be charged with heresy, a crime that was punishable by death at the stake. Catherine's enemies found proof that she had been reading and discussing these banned books with members of her circle of scholars and reformers. They also discovered that she had been corresponding with Protestant leaders in other countries and that she had been supporting the translation of religious texts into English. All of these activities could be seen as evidence that Catherine was a dangerous heretic who was working to undermine the religious stability of England. Gardiner and Wriothesley were delighted with their discovery. They knew that Henry had become increasingly paranoid and suspicious in his old age, and they believed they could convince him that his wife was plotting against him. They carefully prepared their case, gathering evidence and planning exactly how they would present their accusations to the king. The conservatives' plan was simple but deadly. They would convince Henry that Catherine was not just reading forbidden books, but that she was actively working to spread dangerous religious ideas throughout England. They would argue that her influence over the royal children, especially Princess Elizabeth, made her particularly dangerous because she was poisoning the next generation of rulers with heretical ideas. In the spring of 1546, Gardiner and Wriothesley approached Henry with their accusations. They told him that his wife was a secret heretic who was using her position as queen to undermine his authority and spread dangerous religious ideas. They presented their evidence carefully, making sure to emphasize how Catherine's actions could be seen as. Henry listened to these accusations with growing anger and suspicion. His paranoid mind began to imagine all sorts of plots and conspiracies. He remembered how his previous wives had disappointed and betrayed him, and he began to wonder if Catherine was just another deceiver who had been using him for her own purposes. The situation became even more dangerous when Henry's enemies reminded him of recent events that had shaken his confidence. Just months earlier, a Protestant reformer named Askew had been tortured and burned at the stake for her religious beliefs. Askew had been connected to some of the same people in Catherine's circle, and Gardiner suggested that the Queen might be involved in a wider conspiracy against the traditional church. As the accusations against Catherine mounted, Henry's mood grew darker and more threatening. He began to avoid his wife and refused to speak to her about the charges being made against her. Catherine could sense that something was terribly wrong, but she did not yet understand the full extent of the danger she was facing. The crisis reached its peak when Henry secretly authorized the preparation of a warrant for Catherine's arrest. The document charged her with heresy and ordered her to be taken to the Tower of London for questioning and trial. If convicted, Catherine would face the same terrible fate as Askew and other heretics who had been burned alive for their religious beliefs. Catherine's survival now depended on her ability to think quickly and act decisively. When she learned about the plot against her, probably through loyal servants who overheard conversations among her enemies, she knew that she had very little time to save herself. One wrong move could mean death, but doing nothing would certainly be fatal. Catherine decided to use the same weapon that had served her well throughout her marriage to Henry, her intelligence and her deep understanding of the king's personality. She knew that Henry's ego was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, and she planned to use this knowledge to turn the situation in her favor. Late one evening, Catherine went to Henry's private chambers, where he was suffering from the painful sores on his legs that always made him irritable and suspicious. Instead of trying to defend herself against the charges, Catherine took a completely different approach. She threw herself on Henry's mercy and begged him to forgive her for overstepping her bounds as a woman. Catherine told Henry that she had only engaged in religious discussions to distract him from his physical pain and to learn from his superior wisdom and knowledge. She claimed that she had never intended to challenge his authority or promote dangerous ideas, but had simply been trying to be a good wife by showing interest in the subjects that mattered to him. This approach was brilliant because it appealed to Henry's vanity while also playing into his ideas about how women should behave. Catherine presented herself as a humble, submissive wife who had made mistakes out of love and devotion rather than as a dangerous heretic who was plotting against him. Henry's response showed just how well Catherine understood his character. His anger began to fade as his ego was stroked by Catherine's words. He began to see her not as a threat, but as a woman who had been led astray by bad advisers and who could be forgiven for her errors. Catherine Parr had always believed that the mind was the greatest weapon a woman could possess in a world ruled by men. As Queen of England, she decided to use this weapon not just for survival, but to achieve something that no English queen had ever done before. She would become an author and publish books under her own name, proving that royal women could be intellectual leaders and religious thinkers in their own right. The idea of a queen writing and publishing books was revolutionary in the 1540s. Most people believed that women should be silent in matters of religion and learning, leaving such important subjects to men. Even educated noblewomen who could read and write usually kept their thoughts private, sharing them only in letters to friends or family members. For a queen to put her religious and philosophical ideas into print for everyone to read was almost unthinkable. But Catherine had grown up surrounded by books and ideas, and she had spent years developing her own thoughts about faith, religion, and the relationship between God and humanity. She had watched as England struggled through the religious changes that began when Henry broke away from the Catholic Church in Rome. She had seen how these changes affected ordinary people's lives, and she wanted to help guide them through these confusing and frightening times. Catherine began work on her first book in 1544, just a year after becoming queen. She wrote during the early morning hours when the palace was quiet and she could think without interruption. She worked carefully, choosing each word with precision and making sure that her ideas were expressed clearly and simply so that ordinary people could understand them. The book was called Prayers or Meditations, and it was a collection of devotional prayers and thoughts designed to help readers develop a deeper relationship with God. Catherine wrote in English rather than Latin, which made her work accessible to people who had not received expensive classical educations. She focused on practical spirituality, offering guidance for daily prayer and meditation that could help people find peace and strength in difficult times. Catherine's approach to religion was thoughtful and moderate. She avoided the extreme positions that were tearing apart other parts of Europe during the Protestant Reformation. Instead, she emphasized the importance of personal faith, Bible reading, and direct communication with God, while also respecting traditional Christian teachings and practices. This balanced approach appealed to many English people who were confused by the rapid religious changes happening around them. When Prayers or Meditations was published in 1545, it became an immediate success. People were fascinated by the idea of reading a book written by their own queen, and they found Catherine's gentle, practical approach to faith very helpful. The book was reprinted several times, which was unusual for any book in those days when printing was expensive and most books had very small audiences. Catherine's success with her first book encouraged her to begin work on a second, more ambitious project. This new book would be much more personal and would reveal more of her own spiritual journey and religious beliefs. She called it The Lamentation of a Sinner, and it told the story of her own spiritual awakening and conversion to Protestant ideas about salvation and faith. Writing this second book was much more dangerous than writing the first. The Lamentation of a Sinner contained ideas that were clearly Protestant in nature, including the belief that people could be saved through faith alone rather than through good works and church rituals. These ideas were controversial and could be seen as heretical by people who still supported traditional Catholic teachings. Catherine was careful not to publish this second book during Henry's lifetime, understanding that it might put her in danger if her enemies at court decided to use it against her. But she continued to work on it in secret, developing her thoughts and refining her arguments about the nature of salvation and the role of Scripture in Christian life. While working on her books, Catherine also used her position as queen to support learning and religious reform in other ways. She gathered around herself a circle of scholars, writers, and reformers who shared her interests in education and religious questions. Her court became a center of intellectual activity where new ideas were discussed and debated. Catherine was particularly interested in supporting the education of women. She believed that women had just as much right as men to read the Bible, think about religious questions, and participate in scholarly discussions. This was a radical idea in a time when most people thought that women were not capable of serious intellectual work. Under Catherine's influence, Princess Elizabeth received one of the finest educations ever given to a royal woman. Catherine made sure that Elizabeth studied not just languages and literature, but also theology, philosophy, and political theory. She wanted Elizabeth to be prepared to rule England if she ever became queen, and she understood that this would require much more than the traditional female education focused on household management and social skills. Catherine also supported the translation of religious texts into English so that ordinary people could read them. She believed that everyone should have access to the Bible and other important religious works, not just priests and scholars who could read Latin. This was part of the Protestant idea that individuals should be able to read and interpret Scripture for themselves, rather than depending entirely on church authorities to tell them what to believe. The intellectual circle that formed around Catherine included some of the most progressive thinkers of the time. These scholars and reformers found in the Queen a patron who understood their work and could protect them from more conservative opponents who wanted to stop religious and educational reform. Catherine's support for learning and reform extended beyond England's borders. She corresponded with scholars and religious leaders in other countries, sharing ideas and staying informed about intellectual developments across Europe. This international perspective helped her understand how England's religious and educational changes compared to what was happening in other nations. Through her writing and her support for education, Catherine was helping to shape the intellectual and religious future of England. She was proving that women could be serious thinkers and leaders in areas that had traditionally been reserved for men. Most importantly, she was using her position as queen not just to survive in a dangerous world, but to make positive changes that would benefit many people for generations to come. Catherine's work as a scholar and author was just as important as her work as a peacemaker in the royal family. Both roles showed her determination to use her intelligence and position to make a lasting difference in the world around her. When Catherine Parr became Queen of England in July 1543, she inherited much more than a crown and royal title. She inherited a broken family that had been torn apart by years of anger, fear, and bitter disappointment. King Henry's 3 children from his previous marriages were scattered like pieces of a shattered mirror, each carrying deep wounds that seemed impossible to heal. The situation Catherine found was heartbreaking. Princess Mary, now 27 years old, lived in bitter exile from court. She had once been the beloved daughter of a king, destined to inherit the throne and rule England. But when Henry divorced her mother, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary's entire world collapsed. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title as princess, and forced to serve as a lady in waiting to her new baby sister Elizabeth. The humiliation had left deep scars on Mary's heart, and she had never truly forgiven her father for choosing a new wife over her mother. 10-year-old Princess Elizabeth carried different but equally painful wounds. She had been declared illegitimate when her mother Anne Boleyn was executed for treason and adultery. Elizabeth had learned early in life that being the daughter of a king was no guarantee of safety or love. She was brilliant beyond her years, already fluent in Latin, Greek, and French, but she was also cautious and watchful in ways that no child should have to be. The shadow of her mother's execution hung over her like a dark cloud. 6-year-old Prince Edward was the most precious person in the kingdom because he was Henry's only legitimate son and heir to the throne. But this special position had isolated him from normal family life. He was raised by carefully chosen tutors and governors who treated him more like a valuable object than a little boy. Edward rarely saw his father and almost never spent time with his sisters. He was growing up lonely and formal, surrounded by adults who were more concerned with his education as a future king than with his happiness as a child. Catherine looked at this sad situation and saw both a great opportunity and an enormous challenge. She understood that healing these family relationships would not be easy. Years of hurt feelings, broken promises, and fear had built walls between Henry and his children that seemed almost impossible to break down. But Catherine also knew that if she could succeed in bringing this family together, she would accomplish something that none of Henry's previous wives had managed. She would make herself truly valuable to the king in a way that went far beyond being just another wife. Catherine began her work slowly and carefully. She understood that she could not rush into the middle of these complicated relationships and expect to fix everything quickly. Instead, she started by building trust with each of the royal children individually, learning their personalities and understanding their specific needs and fears. With Princess Mary, Catherine used her own maturity and intelligence to build a relationship based on mutual respect. Mary had grown suspicious of stepmothers after her terrible experiences with Anne Boleyn, but Catherine was different. She was older and more dignified than Henry's previous wives, and she treated Mary like the adult woman she had become rather than trying to mother her. Catherine engaged Mary in serious conversations about religion, politics, and literature. She asked for Mary's opinions and listened carefully to her answers. Slowly, Mary began to trust this new stepmother who seemed to value her mind and respect her dignity. Catherine's approach with young Elizabeth was different but equally thoughtful. She recognized that Elizabeth was exceptionally intelligent and hungry for knowledge, but also deeply insecure about her place in the world. Catherine became both a protector and a mentor to Elizabeth, ensuring that she received the finest education available while also providing the emotional support that the girl desperately needed. Catherine arranged for Elizabeth to study with the best scholars in England, including Roger Ascham, who would later write that Elizabeth was one of the most brilliant students he had ever taught. With little Prince Edward, Catherine worked to bring more warmth and family feeling into his formal, isolated life. She arranged for him to spend time with his sisters and tried to create opportunities for him to be a normal little boy as well as a future king. Catherine understood that Edward needed to learn not just about ruling a kingdom, but also about being part of a family. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine began to change Henry's attitude toward his children. She used her influence over the king to remind him of the joy and pride that his children could bring him. When Henry was in good moods, Catherine would tell him about Elizabeth's progress in her studies or Mary's thoughtful opinions about political matters. She would arrange for the children to be present during family meals and social gatherings, creating opportunities for Henry to see them as individuals rather than just symbols of his past marriages. Catherine's patience and skill began to pay off. Gradually, the walls between Henry and his children started to come down. Mary was invited back to court and began to play a more active role in royal life. Elizabeth flourished under Catherine's protection and guidance, growing in confidence as well as knowledge. Edward began to experience something closer to a normal family life, with sisters who cared about him and a stepmother who made sure he had time to play as well as study. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Foreign ambassadors who visited the English court began to comment on how happy and unified the royal family seemed. This was very different from the tense, fearful atmosphere that had characterized Henry's court during his previous marriages. Catherine had created an environment where the royal children could be together as siblings, something that had not happened for many years. One of Catherine's greatest triumphs came in 1544 when she convinced Henry to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. This was a major political decision that required an act of Parliament, but Catherine understood its importance for the future of England. By ensuring that his daughters could inherit the throne if anything happened to Edward, Catherine was protecting the stability of the kingdom and giving both girls a sense of purpose and belonging that they had lost years earlier. Catherine's success in healing the royal family relationships was not just good for the children involved. It also made her position as queen much more secure. Henry could see that Catherine had brought peace and happiness to his household in ways that none of his previous wives had managed. She had proven herself to be not just a wife, but a true partner who could help him solve problems and build a better future for his dynasty. By the spring of 1543, Catherine Parr thought she had found happiness at last. After 13 years of being a widow from her first marriage and then losing her second husband, Lord John Neville, earlier that year, she was finally free to follow her heart. She was secretly in love with Thomas Seymour, a charming and handsome man who made her feel young and alive again. Thomas was the brother of Jane Seymour, King Henry's third wife, who had died giving birth to Prince Edward. He was also one of the most attractive men at court, with dark eyes and a smile that could make any woman's heart race. Catherine and Thomas had been meeting in secret, stealing moments together in quiet corners of palaces and writing each other love letters. For the first time since she was a young girl, Catherine felt the excitement of true romance. She dreamed of marrying Thomas and living a quiet life away from the dangerous world of court politics. At 31, she had enough money from her previous marriages to live comfortably, and Thomas seemed to love her for who she was rather than for her wealth or connections. But Catherine's dreams of a peaceful love story were about to be shattered by the most powerful and dangerous man in England. King Henry VIII had noticed her. Henry was no longer the golden prince who had charmed Europe in his youth. At 52 years old, he had become a massive, frightening figure who could barely walk because of the painful sores on his legs. His face was bloated and his temper was worse than ever. He had already executed his fifth wife, young Catherine Howard, just 2 years earlier. The smell of death seemed to follow him wherever he went, and courtiers whispered that God was punishing him for his many sins. But Henry was still the king, and when the King of England wanted something, he expected to get it. He had been watching Catherine Parr for months, impressed by her intelligence and her ability to discuss the religious and political questions that fascinated him. Unlike his previous wives, Catherine was a mature woman who could match his intellect and engage him in serious conversation. She was also beautiful in a quiet, dignified way that appealed to Henry's changing tastes. The king began to pay attention to Catherine in ways that made everyone at court nervous. He would seek her out at social gatherings and engage her in long conversations about theology and philosophy. He would ask her opinions about political matters and listen carefully to her answers. Courtiers who understood the signs began to whisper that Catherine Parr was about to become Henry's next target for marriage. Catherine realized what was happening and felt her world falling apart. She knew the stories of Henry's previous wives. Anne Boleyn had lost her head when she failed to give Henry a son and when he grew tired of her sharp tongue. Jane Seymour had died in childbirth, but at least she had died as a queen rather than on the executioner's block. Anne of Cleves had been lucky enough to survive by agreeing to a quick divorce. Catherine Howard had been executed for adultery, though many people believe she was more foolish than truly guilty. The pattern was clear. Marriage to Henry VIII was extremely dangerous, and Catherine had no guarantee that she would be one of the lucky ones who survived. But she also understood that she had very little choice in the matter. When a king decided he wanted to marry someone, refusing him was not really an option. Saying no to Henry could be seen as treason, which was punishable by death. Catherine made one of the most difficult decisions of her life. She went to Thomas Seymour and told him that she could not marry him. With tears in her eyes, she explained that God's will seemed to be leading her toward a different path. Thomas was heartbroken and angry, but he understood the reality of their situation as well as Catherine did. To refuse the king would put both of their lives in danger. As Henry's courtship became more obvious, Catherine began to prepare herself for what lay ahead. She studied Henry's character and tried to understand what had gone wrong in his previous marriages. She realized that most of his wives had failed because they had tried to be what they thought he wanted rather than being themselves. They had tried to manipulate him with beauty, tears, or sexual attraction, but they had never really connected with his mind. Catherine decided on a different strategy. She would be honest about who she was, an educated, thoughtful woman who genuinely enjoyed discussing ideas and solving problems. She would not try to be young and innocent like Catherine Howard or mysterious and seductive like Anne Boleyn. Instead, she would be a partner and companion to Henry, someone who could share his intellectual interests and help him with the burden of ruling England. This approach seemed to work. Henry found himself drawn to Catherine's intelligence and her calm, steady personality. She never seemed nervous or frightened around him, which was unusual. Most people at court were terrified of the king and showed it in their behavior. But Catherine treated Henry with respect while still maintaining her own dignity. She listened to his ideas but also offered her own thoughts and opinions. Catherine also began to observe Henry's relationship with his children, and she saw an opportunity to make herself truly valuable to him. His 3 children from previous marriages were scattered and estranged from their father. Princess Mary was 27 and lived away from court, still bitter about being declared illegitimate when Henry divorced her mother. Princess Elizabeth was 10 years old and also carried the stigma of illegitimacy after her mother's execution. Prince Edward was 6 and the precious heir to the throne, but he was kept isolated from his sisters and raised by tutors and governors rather than family. Catherine began to form a plan that went far beyond just surviving marriage to Henry. She would try to heal the broken relationships in the royal family and bring Henry's children back into his life. If she could succeed in this, she would not only be doing something good for the children, but she would also make herself indispensable to Henry in a way that none of his previous wives had managed. The wedding was set for July 12, 1543. As the date approached, Catherine spent her time preparing not just for the ceremony, but for the dangerous game of survival that would begin immediately afterward. She would need all of her intelligence, education, and courage to navigate the treacherous waters of marriage to the most unpredictable king in Europe. The year was 1512, when Catherine Parr entered the world at Kendal Castle in the northern county of Westmoreland. England was a very different place then. King Henry VIII had just become king 3 years earlier, and he was still the golden young prince that all of Europe admired. He was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the country was still loyal to the Catholic Church in Rome. No one could have imagined that this baby girl born in a castle far from London would one day become the wife who would outlive the king and help change England forever. Catherine's father was Sir Thomas Parr, a man who served King Henry at court but also managed large estates in the north of England. The Parr family was well respected and had money, but they were not among the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. This middle position turned out to be perfect for young Catherine. Her family was important enough to give her a good education and connections at court, but not so important that they were constantly in danger from the king's changing moods. Sir Thomas Parr believed that knowledge was power. He made sure that his children, including his daughters, received the best education possible. This was unusual for the time, when most people thought that girls only needed to learn how to run a household and please a husband. But Thomas Parr was a forward-thinking man who understood that the world was changing and that intelligent children would have better chances in life. Catherine's mother, Maud Green, was even more important in shaping her daughter's future. Maud served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, which meant she spent time at court and understood how the royal world worked. She saw firsthand how dangerous court life could be, but she also saw the opportunities that existed for clever, well-educated women. Maud Green was determined that her daughter would never be helpless or dependent on others for survival. She arranged for Catherine to have tutors who taught her Latin, the language of scholars and the church. Catherine learned to read and write in French and Italian, languages that would help her communicate with foreign diplomats and read books from other countries. She studied mathematics, history, and philosophy. Most importantly, she learned about religion and theology, subjects that would become central to her later life. The Parr household was filled with books, which was rare in those days when books were expensive and hard to find. Catherine grew up surrounded by the ideas of great thinkers and writers. She read the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors. She studied the Bible and the writings of church fathers. She also read newer works by humanist scholars who were beginning to question old ways of thinking about religion and society. When Catherine was just 5 years old, her comfortable world was shattered by tragedy. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, died suddenly, leaving behind a widow and 3 young children. Catherine watched as her mother faced the difficult challenge of protecting her family's interests without a husband to support her. In those days, when a man died, other men often tried to take advantage of his widow and steal her property. But Maud Green was not an ordinary widow. She used all the skills she had learned at court to fight for her children's rights. She made sure that Catherine and her siblings inherited their father's lands and money. She formed alliances with powerful friends who could protect her family. Most importantly, she showed young Catherine that a woman could be strong and independent, even in a world controlled by men. Catherine learned important lessons by watching her mother during these difficult years. She saw that survival often depended on being smarter than your enemies. She learned that a woman had to be twice as clever as a man to achieve the same results. She discovered that knowledge and education were weapons that no one could take away from her. As Catherine grew older, her education continued under her mother's careful guidance. She became fluent in several languages and could discuss complex ideas with scholars and nobles. She learned to play musical instruments and to dance, skills that would serve her well at court. But most importantly, she developed a deep interest in religious questions that were becoming more important as England began to change. During Catherine's childhood, new ideas about religion were spreading across Europe. A German monk named Martin Luther had challenged the authority of the Catholic Church and started what would become known as the Protestant Reformation. These ideas were slowly making their way to England, where some people began to question whether the Pope in Rome should have so much power over English religious life. Catherine was exposed to these new ideas through her education and through the books in her family's library. She learned to think critically about religious questions and to form her own opinions about what she believed. This intellectual independence would later prove crucial when she became queen, and had to navigate the dangerous religious politics of Henry's court. When Catherine was 14 years old, her mother arranged her first marriage to Sir Edward Berg, a wealthy landowner who was much older than Catherine. This was normal for girls of noble families, who were usually married young to create political alliances and economic partnerships between families. Catherine understood that marriage was her duty, but she also knew that she would need to use all the skills her mother had taught her to survive and thrive as a wife. The wedding took place in 1526, and Catherine found herself managing a large household and dealing with adult responsibilities while she was still essentially a child. But her excellent education and strong character helped her adapt to married life. She learned to run estates, manage servants, and handle money. She also continued her studies, reading books on theology and philosophy in her spare time. Catherine's first marriage lasted only 4 years. When Sir Edward Berg died in 1530, 18-year-old Catherine faced her first real test as an independent woman. She had to protect her inheritance and find a way to support herself in a world that offered few options for women alone. But thanks to the education and strength her parents had given her, Catherine was ready for the challenges ahead. The cold morning air hung heavy over London as Catherine Parr stepped from her carriage and looked up at the towering walls of Hampton Court Palace. It was the summer of 1543, and she was about to become the 6th wife of the most feared king in England. Henry VIII had already killed 2 of his wives and divorced 2 others. The fifth wife, young Catherine Howard, had lost her head on the executioner's block just 2 years before. Most women would have trembled at the thought of marrying such a dangerous man. But Catherine Parr was not most women. At 31 years old, she had already buried 2 husbands and survived the harsh realities of Tudor England. She was educated, intelligent, and had learned the art of survival in a world where women had little power but faced enormous risks. Catherine knew the stories that people whispered about King Henry. They called him a monster who destroyed anyone who crossed him. They said his temper was like a wild storm that could strike without warning. They spoke of how he had grown fat and sick, his legs covered in painful sores that made him scream in agony. But Catherine also knew something that others did not understand. She knew that this dangerous king was also a lonely man who desperately wanted someone to talk to, someone who could match his intelligence and share his interests. Unlike Henry's previous wives, Catherine came to this marriage with experience and wisdom. She had been born into a world of books and learning. Her mother had made sure that Catherine could read Latin, French, and Italian. She could discuss theology and philosophy with the greatest scholars of her time. She had read the works of ancient writers and could debate the meaning of religious texts. In an age when most women could barely write their own names, Catherine Parr was one of the most educated women in England. Her first marriage had been arranged when she was just 14 years old. She married Sir Edward Berg, a man much older than herself, and learned what it meant to be a wife in a world controlled by men. When Edward died after 4 years of marriage, Catherine discovered what it meant to be a widow. She had to fight to keep her property and protect herself from men who wanted to take advantage of her situation. Her second marriage to Lord John Neville brought her closer to the royal court. She learned how to navigate the dangerous world of palace politics, where a wrong word could mean death and where friends could become enemies overnight. When Lord Neville died in 1543, Catherine found herself a wealthy widow with lands and money of her own. She was also in love with Thomas Seymour, a handsome courtier who made her heart race with excitement. But then King Henry noticed her. When the King of England wanted something, he usually got it. Catherine faced an impossible choice. She could refuse the king and risk his anger, which might mean prison or death. Or she could accept his proposal and enter a marriage that had already proven deadly for other women. She knew that saying no to Henry VIII was not really an option. Catherine made her decision with the same intelligence and courage that had carried her through her previous challenges. She would marry the king, but she would do it on her own terms. She would not try to be the young, innocent girl that Henry seemed to prefer. Instead, she would be exactly what she was, a mature, educated woman who could be his partner in ways that his previous wives never could. The wedding took place on July 12, 1543, in a small chamber at Hampton Court Palace. It was a quiet ceremony, very different from Henry's previous grand weddings. Catherine wore a simple dress and stood beside a king who was old enough to be her father. But as she spoke her wedding vows, Catherine was already planning how she would survive and even thrive in this most dangerous of marriages. Catherine understood that Henry's previous wives had failed because they had tried to be what they thought he wanted rather than showing him what he actually needed. And Boleyn had tried to control him with her beauty and wit, but had pushed too hard and lost her head. Jane Seymour had given him a son but died in childbirth before she could secure her position. Anne of Cleves had been too foreign and different for Henry's taste. Catherine Howard had been too young and foolish, making mistakes that cost her life. Catherine would be different. She would use her greatest strength, her mind, to make herself indispensable to Henry. She would engage him in the intellectual discussions that he craved but rarely found at court. She would listen to his concerns about religion and politics and offer thoughtful responses. She would show him respect without being weak. And she would demonstrate her intelligence without threatening his authority. But Catherine had an even more ambitious plan. She had noticed that Henry's 3 children from his previous marriages were scattered and estranged from their father. Princess Mary was 27 years old and lived away from court, declared illegitimate and forgotten. Princess Elizabeth was just 10 years old, also declared illegitimate and carrying the shame of her mother's execution. Prince Edward was 6 years old and the heir to the throne, but he was kept away from his sisters and raised in isolation. Catherine saw an opportunity to heal this broken family. She believed that if she could bring Henry's children back into his life and help them find their place at court, she would not only be doing something good but also protecting herself. A king who was happy with his family life would be less likely to turn against his wife. As Catherine settled into her new role as Queen of England, she was already thinking several steps ahead. She would prove that a woman could be both intelligent and loyal, both strong and diplomatic. She would show that marriage to Henry VIII did not have to end in tragedy. Most importantly, she would use her position not just to survive, but to make positive changes that would outlast her own life. The courtiers who watched Catherine Parr become Henry's sixth queen had no idea that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most remarkable reigns in English history. This quiet, thoughtful woman would become the queen who lived, the stepmother who healed a royal family, and the reformer who helped shape the religious future of England.